It started as a moment of joy, a family moving into their dream home, ready to start a new chapter. But what should have been a day of celebration quickly turned into a tense, unforgettable experience. A black family had just finished unloading boxes when their new neighbor, suspicious of their presence, called the police, claiming they were trespassing. The twist: they weren't trespassing, they owned the house. What followed was a confrontation that left everyone stunned, revealing assumptions, biases, and the powerful impact of misunderstanding. As officers arrived, the family calmly explained their situation, even showing proof of ownership. But the tension in the air was palpable. Why did the neighbor jump to conclusions? How did this situation unfold, and what lessons can we all take from it? Stay tuned as we dive into this eye-opening story that shines a light on community, trust, and the reality of navigating these challenges today. The family, the Johnsons, had spent months saving and planning for this home. A fresh start in a quiet neighborhood where they hoped to build memories. They had introduced themselves to a few neighbors during the move, but not everyone was home. The man across the street, Mr. Carter, had only glanced at them earlier that day but hadn't said a word. As the police cars pulled up, the Johnsons stood in their driveway, confused but determined to stay calm. Mrs. Johnson held the deed to the house, her hands trembling slightly as she braced for what was coming. Mr. Johnson tried to reassure their two young kids, who were wide-eyed and clinging to his legs. Across the street, Mr. Carter watched from his porch, arms crossed, convinced he had done the right thing. But why had he been so quick to assume the worst? The answer would soon come to light. As the officers stepped out of their cars, the quiet suburban street seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Johnson greeted them with a steady voice, though he could feel his heart pounding. He handed over the documents, explaining they had just closed on the house a week ago. One officer took the papers while another approached Mr. Carter, who had come down his porch to meet them. "I called because I saw people I didn't recognize going in and out all day," Mr. Carter said. His tone was firm, but his gaze kept darting back to the Johnsons, as if he were still searching for something suspicious. The officers listened but didn't seem to share his urgency. Mrs. Johnson, standing nearby, could sense a growing unease. This wasn't just about mistaken identity, it felt personal. Inside the house, the Johnson children peeked through the curtains, whispering, "Why are the police here?" Meanwhile, a few other neighbors had begun to gather, watching from their yards, some murmuring quietly. As the officers continued their investigation, Mr. Carter's reasoning became clearer and more unsettling. But what would happen next would challenge everyone's assumptions in unexpected ways. The street was now alive with murmurs and sidelong glances as more neighbors emerged, drawn by the flashing lights and rising tension. Mr. Carter stood his ground, his arms crossed tightly. "I've lived here for 20 years," he said to one of the officers. "I know everyone on this block, and I've never seen them before. How do I know they didn't break in?" The officer holding the Johnsons' paperwork glanced at Mr. Carter, then back at the documents. "Everything checks out," he said calmly. "They're the new owners. This is their home." But the words didn't seem to register with Mr. Carter. "Carter, new owners? Nobody told me this house was sold," he snapped, his voice rising. "I don't know what's going on, but something isn't right here." The tension was thick, the air heavy with unspoken words. Mrs. Johnson, feeling a surge of frustration, finally spoke up. "We've done nothing wrong," she said firmly. "We're here to raise our kids, just like you raised yours. Why can't you accept that?" Before anyone could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the growing crowd. It was one of the neighbors, an older woman who had lived in the neighborhood even longer than Mr. Carter. Maybe instead of assuming the worst, You should welcome them like you were welcomed here all those years ago." The words hung in the air, challenging Mr. Carter and everyone else who had been quick to judge. But as emotions boiled over, the real question lingered. Would this moment be a turning point, or would the divide grow even deeper? For a moment, the street fell silent after the neighbor's words, the weight of her comment pressing down on everyone. Mr. Carter hesitated, his expression flickering between defensiveness and something more vulnerable: uncertainty. Just as it seemed the tension might ease, another unexpected twist sent shockwaves through the crowd. From the back of the group, a younger man stepped forward. He was holding a clipboard, wearing a uniform from the local utility company. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the whispers. "I'm here to finalize a work order for this property. Are you the homeowners?" Mr. and Mrs. Johnson exchanged a puzzled glance before nodding. "Yes, that's us," Mr. Johnson replied cautiously. The utility worker cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Well, there's an issue. It seems someone submitted a cancellation request for all the services at this address: electricity, water, internet. I just wanted to confirm before proceeding." The crowd stirred, confusion giving way to suspicion. Mrs. Johnson's face went pale. "We didn't cancel anything," she said firmly. "We just moved in. Why would we do that?" The officer nearest to the utility worker frowned, his attention now shifting toward Mr. Carter. "Do you know anything about this?" he asked pointedly. Caught off guard, Mr. Carter stammered, I don't know what you're implying. I didn't call anyone." But the timing felt too coincidental, and the atmosphere shifted again, this time with the Johnsons realizing they might be dealing with more than just an overzealous neighbor. The stakes had just been raised, leaving everyone to wonder, was this a simple misunderstanding, or something far more deliberate? The officer's question hung in the air, and for the first time, Mr. Carter looked genuinely nervous. Before he could respond, another neighbor, a younger woman who had been watching quietly, spoke up. "Actually, I saw something strange earlier today," she said hesitantly. "A man in a truck parked in front of their house for a while. He was messing with something near the side of the building." The utility worker's face lit up with recognition. That might explain it. If someone tampered with the meter or utilities, it could trigger a cancellation request. "I'll need to report this." All eyes turned to Mr. Carter, who suddenly looked cornered. "I don't know anything about that." He protested, but his defensive tone only deepened the suspicion. One of the officers asked him to step aside for further questioning, and the murmurs among the neighbors grew louder. Meanwhile, inside the house, the Johnsons were met with another surprise. When Mr. Johnson checked the security footage from their recently installed cameras, the truth came out. The footage showed a man matching Mr. Carter's description walking along the side of the house earlier that day, holding what looked like tools. When confronted with the evidence, Mr. Carter's demeanor shifted from defiance to guilt. I didn't want things to change," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "This neighborhood has always been quiet, familiar. I thought if I could scare you off." He trailed off, realizing his actions had gone far beyond what he could justify. The officers informed Mr. Carter that tampering with utilities and filing false reports were serious offenses, leaving the Johnsons stunned by the lengths he had gone to. As the police escorted him back to his home for further questioning, the neighbors began to step forward, offering apologies and words of welcome to the Johnsons. Just when it seemed the chaos was finally over, Mr. Johnson received a notification on his phone. The security system had captured another figure sneaking around their backyard, someone entirely different. The Johnsons exchanged uneasy glances. Was this truly the end, or just the beginning of another mystery? The Johnsons rushed to check their backyard, their hearts pounding. But as the security footage played, they realized it was just a delivery driver dropping off a package near the back porch. A wave of relief washed over them, but the day's events left them shaken. Over the next few days, the neighborhood seemed to reset. Several neighbors came by to formally welcome the Johnsons, bringing baked goods and kind words. Even the older woman who had spoken up earlier shared stories about the community's history, making the Johnsons feel more at home. Mr. Carter, meanwhile, kept to himself, his actions leaving a cloud of tension. While the Johnsons chose not to press charges, they hoped he had learned a lesson about jumping to conclusions and how his actions could have caused serious harm. As the days turned into weeks, the Johnsons began settling in, turning the house into a home. Their experience reminded them, and everyone watching, of the importance of communication, understanding, and giving people a chance before making assumptions. In the end, it wasn't just a story about one family. It was a reflection of how communities can grow stronger when people confront their biases and choose kindness over fear.